I actually did want to talk to you about that, the idea of implicit biases and that repression, because I remember speaking to a friend who's a little bit older than me, and we were talking about our experiences of growing up in small rural towns, he in the UK and me here, and just the kind of learnt homophobia that becomes sort of ingrained in you, that you gradually realise over your life, implicit biases, thoughts, negative thoughts that come out. And for him, it was an interesting conversation because he was gay. And so he said, yeah, I have the same things, these things that I've learnt over time. I grew up in this really small, stifled, small mining village, and at my late 40s now, it still plays out.
Oh, I think that's right. I think it's great that somebody can acknowledge that. And, I think there are clear and obvious parallels to racism. I'd be very suspicious of anyone who claims that they don't notice the race of someone when they meet them. I think, of course we do. We're programmed from early on by all sorts of social and cultural norms to do that. And I think the same is true of sexuality. And I think that it's hard now to recognize the extent to which the writings of Freud about sex were so radical at the time, because now, of course, even people who claim that they have no interest, that they disdain Freud, and there's a whole school of writers who've attacked Freud very vehemently, but in fact we live in a world in which a lot of our understanding of human behaviour and human sexuality actually is derived from things that Freud and people like Freud were writing about a century ago. In the same way, I think that the influence of Marx is there. Even, the right-wing neoliberals in the Institute for, I can't think what IPA stands for.
Institute of Public Affairs.
Right. Well, none of them would claim to be Marxist, but in a funny way, they're all, of course, shaped by a civilization in which some of Marx's assumptions have just become taken for granted.
I mean, even within psychology, but when most people think of psychology, they think of Freud, and the same thing with Marx, is that they've essentially become part of the zeitgeist.
Yes, I think that's right. Of course, they're also then used as terms of abuse. So if you read the Murdoch press, you will discover that our universities are totally controlled by cultural Marxists. Given that most people who control our universities seem to be middle-level bureaucrats who've come out of corporate Australia, that seems to me rather unlikely, but I don't want to shatter the dreams of the Murdoch columnists.
Yeah, I guess there's all sorts of different moving parts to that as far as I can see. I mean, one, it's that this term, the cultural Marxism term, has become extremely popular in a way of classifying far-left thought. And also, I suppose there are reasonable Marxist movements. I mean, Latrobe has a Marxist movement. But I do think there's an interesting thing that you write about in terms of left and far left identity politics. And I wondered what you thought about some of the things which are popular in the Murdoch press, such as the cancel culture that occurs in America, where the speakers are disinvited to campuses.
Well, I think this is complicated, and in fact it's something that Latrobe University at the moment is going through a very large-scale discussion that one of my colleagues is intimately involved in about what sorts of limits should exist in a university environment around free speech. And I tend to err towards the more permissive side. So, for example, I would not want to ban Germaine Greer because she has views on people who are trans that people who are trans find offensive.
Yes.
But some of the cases in the US, possibly here as well, have involved people who are so clearly bent on stirring up hatred that can very easily escalate into violence and into attacks that I think it is reasonable. So, for example, I would not allow, if I ran a university, which I unfortunately don't, though I suspect the VC would agree with me, I don't think any of us would allow a Nazi to speak on campus and call for the extermination of everyone who's not Aryan. I don't think there can be absolute free speech. So that I think the problem is that being offended is not the same thing as being threatened. And there is a sense in which the two seem to often run together. I don't have much sympathy with people who want to stop things just because they might be offended by them. There are so many examples of explicitly racist attacks in our society at the moment that I think it is reasonable to draw a line. And where you draw the line is, I think, very difficult. And of course, there has been a federal government report. Robert French, former Chief Justice, I think, did a report. And I think he was right. I mean, he said it isn't a great issue in Australia, but there need to be certain guidelines. And some universities, I know the ANU in particular has led the way on this, but as I say, La Trobe now is going through a very interesting and exhaustive process where they are really consulting right across the university to try and figure out exactly where you draw the line.